Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Balsillie School of International Affairs Environment and Resource Research Cluster's webinar on engaging government for environmental policy research, the view from Ottawa. As many of you probably know, I'm Neil Craik. I'm one of the co-leads of the Environment and Resources Research Cluster here at the Balsillie School, along with my colleague, Deborah Van Nyneten. And we're really thrilled today to have some real expertise with us in the policy processes. And maybe I'll just give a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to turn things over to our colleague, Trevor Swordfraser, to do some introductions. But for many of us who kind of work in the sort of research policy interface, I think government and engaging government is really an important part of our work. Very often we're trying to calibrate research questions to conduct research that we hope is policy relevant, that is helpful to the questions that policymakers have to make. Often we've done research and we're trying to draw attention to it, either people in the NGO community, people in government, but there's a lot of processes. I've certainly organized events with governments, and I'm told things about protocols, about how I have to, if I want an assistant deputy minister, I have to invite a deputy minister and it'll get passed down, and all these sort of strange little protocols around Ottawa that for those of us who aren't natives of the ecosystem might find a little mysterious. So we've assembled, and when I say we, really Trevor has assembled just a first-rate panel of experts, and we're really looking forward to a discussion about these questions. And so I'm going to turn it over to our colleague Trevor. If you don't know Trevor, Trevor is a former Assistant Deputy Minister, former head of Parks Canada, so someone who's had a long and an extensive background in government, mostly in resource and environment areas, and he's currently at the University of Waterloo as a sort of practitioner researcher in residence, and he's a member of the research cluster, and is a tremendous resource if you haven't met or talked to Trevor about anything about how government operates. And Trevor was really the brains behind this, and certainly was able to draw in such a great panel. And so I'll turn it over to you, Trevor, with my thanks, to do some introductions to people I think you know very well.
Great. Thanks very much, Neil. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody here this morning. I appreciate the work that you and Deb have done to bring all this together, and Joanne to make it work. And I'd certainly start by thanking our panelists for joining us. It's a busy time for everybody, so I really appreciate you taking the time. As Neil has mentioned, I spent 30 years in the federal public service, working in Environment Canada, fisheries and oceans, and right at the end in parks. And one of the good things about being a Fed is that if you're interested in doing so, you can move around and see the country a fair bit. So I started in Ontario, I worked in the Atlantic region, I lived in the prairies, I lived in Pacific, and then came back to the hub of the universe and the source of all wisdom, obviously not Toronto, but Ottawa. And so among the many benefits in having a career of that nature and span is you get to meet a lot of great people, a lot of interesting folks, and the four panelists that have joined us today are examples of that for me. I was trying to figure out sort of what order I would introduce everybody to, and I was thinking, because I know some of them and how they think, they might read some kind of an agenda into my sequencing. So I picked an absolutely arbitrary organizational approach, and I'm going to introduce people in order of how long I've known them. So I've known Julie for, it's hard to believe when you look at her, I've known her for over 30 years. You can recognize the gray in my beard, but so you can get a sense that's a fair ways. There you go. When Julie and I met, we had a conversation that we spent a fair bit of time talking about She was working in Nature Canada, and I was at that point hindering the bureaucracy, and we spent a fair bit of time talking about where you could have the most influence over time. Certainly, Julie's had a tremendous influence. She's led a national environmental group. She's worked in the mining sector, which is not an obvious segue for a lot of people, and I think that it's a real testament to her approach to sustainability, that rather than just staying in one domain, she's actually moved around. And then, of course, ended up as the Commissioner for Sustainable Development, what some people refer to as the Auditor General for the Environment, which is an extremely high impact role and so on. And so she's got quite a broad diversity of experience, both in the environmental community, in the industry world, and then in sort of an in-betweener, for lack of a better term, and brings a pretty solid understanding of all of those substance areas, as well as, of course, government. Josh Loughran is now the head of Oceana Canada, and Josh I met probably about 20 years ago, just before this all started. I know we were all doing Old Home Week, reintroducing to each other, and Josh was with World Wildlife Fund when I first came across him, and we had a number of great conversations about a whole variety of issues, but particularly around species at risk. And one of our leaders of the broader community at the time, Monty Hummel, was the head of World Wildlife Fund, and certainly brought a lot of us together, and it's a legacy that transcends them. Josh is a biologist. He's got a deep and solid understanding of things biological in nature and so on, but also has a family background in history and politics, understands how government works really well, and has a strong experience as a result of all of that, and both in the wildlife community. And now a national and indeed international leadership position in Oceana. Oceana is an international organization. It obviously has a fairly substantial operation here in Canada. So Josh and his team are focused on things, oceans in Canada, but also part of the global community. So with Josh, we get a multiple set of angles as well. John Moffat, who I noticed has joined us now, is currently the Assistant Deputy Minister Environmental Protection Branch, but of course when I knew him, first met him quite some years ago as well, he was doing a whole series of environmental advocacy type things. I now have a son who is a lawyer, so I've decided I have to make fewer lawyer jokes, none of which usually go over really well anyway. I mean, as we all know, lawyers are, I mean, you got to have them, right? And so, you know, John has a strong legal background, and as bio notes, practiced law for a little while, brings a strong legal perspective to things, worked outside government as a lobbyist and a supporter and so on of policy advocacy and so on, but now is right in the bubble, so to speak, in the inside of an awful lot of hot files in the environment community. And then Tim Kennedy is interesting for me for a whole variety of reasons. Among them is that early in my time at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, I was the head of the aquaculture program. And so I came to know that industry quite well, and first came across Tim in that context, where he and I worked on a number of issues together, and both with him and his predecessor, who was perfectly named. Her name, of course, was Ruth Salmon. What better name could you have for someone working in aquaculture? But through that sort of experience, I met Tim and came to understand that, again, his knowledge of how government works, both from being a part of it in the political staffer role, in a government relations consultant type role, and now as the leader of a fairly substantial and substantive industry lobby organization, again, brings a whole set of perspectives. So the panel that we've assembled really is designed to give people a bit of a breadth across a mix of government, environmental community, political staffers, and a whole set of different angles and perspectives and things. I kind of look at it like a big old Rubik's Cube with multiple facets on it, and you turn it around all kinds of different ways. These panelists should be able to help us do that. And so I'm really glad to see that we've had so many people join us. It's a testament to the draw of the panelists. I'm very glad to see some of my former students in there. I was quite happy to see Maggie Bunbury's name show up, because now I don't have to worry about whether or not we'll have any questions. So with that, I'll say back to you, Neil, and away we go. And thanks again to everybody for joining.
Sure. Thanks again, Trevor, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Maybe just before we get started, Deb, we should just run over how people can ask questions and how that's going to work.
Sure. So for the folks who have joined us, Neil is going to be posing questions primarily to one of the panelists just to start, and then we're hoping that the other panelists will like to chime in. But throw your questions in the chat at any time, okay? And I will field them. And just for our panelists here, I'm going to try to interject once in a while, because if one of our attendees has got a really good question that pertains to what you're discussing, I might just insert myself in there, okay? So attendees, please do shoot your questions into the chat. We're very, very happy to receive them. And of course, this panel is for you, right? To answer your questions and to give you some insights. So please do ask whatever you want.
Yeah, thanks, Deb, and thanks everyone. And yeah, and our hope is just to, you know, we'll try to keep it as conversational as possible. And maybe, you know, my starting point actually comes from something that Trevor said to me about a year ago, and he mentioned that academics sometimes are under the misapprehension that we bring a lot of, you know, firepower to environmental discussions. And he reminded me that when he was in government, he had something, you know, like 60 or 70 PhDs working under him. And so, you know, we recognize that the Canadian government, especially science-driven ministries, you know, have, you know, really significant in internal capacity to develop policy through science and social science. And I guess, John, maybe I'll pose this, John Moffat, to you as a starting point. You know, in light of the huge capacity of government, what do you think the best role for academic researchers and academic research is in the policy processes?
Hi, morning, everybody. Interesting question. Let me just first of all apologize. I'm going to have to leave. I said at 11. Now it's 10:30. I just got invited / summoned. This is one of these inside Ottawa things where you get invited to meetings that it's really not an invitation. But I look forward to the conversation. So I'm glad you finished the question the way you did, Neil, because far be it from me to or for any bureaucrat to suggest you know, what the appropriate scope of research is for academics. But if the question is, you know, how to best influence policy, I think it's probably useful to think about I guess sort of two things in particular. I'll give you a couple of examples. So on the science side, like on the hard science side, in my career working in environmental protection, you know, ongoing science is critical to help us identify issues that need to be addressed, to determine whether issues have been adequately addressed, so you know, in some cases it may appear to people doing research that government is tone deaf and not responding. I won't make any excuses for the speed with which we respond, but I can assure you that the more science and the kind of the more it focuses on identifying a particular issue, the more likely it is that the issue will be addressed. So that's kind of the way in which one way in which research can influence decisions that have not yet been made. Another way is a very different way is that I've also been quite involved in is engaging with the public and in changing social discourse. So in ways that may seem obvious to the people participating, but where it's hard for government on its own to do that. So I've been pretty centrally involved in helping design the government's approach to carbon pricing. at a technical level, that was fundamentally a political decision, but a critical element in the evolution of carbon pricing in Canada was play by a number of third-party organizations that were comprised significantly of researchers from various disciplines who sort of helped normalize some of the concepts. And you know, that's not exactly cutting edge research, but that speaks to the trusted role of academics in society.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Maybe I'll just flip the question a little bit to some of the other panelists, and many of you've been involved in interventions and engagements, and maybe I'll start with Julie, and maybe you can talk just a little bit about how you've engaged with the research community, and if you have any examples of what you think have been really effective interventions by the research community in policy processes.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm glad to be here. Similar to what you just asked, Neil, and what John said, I think it's really important. One of the biggest roles that the academic community can play is to engage with the public and with leading NGOs. And that's where leading NGOs get their policy perspective by translating that academic research into positions that the government can then adopt. So one of the things that one of you sent out a variety of questions to us, and one of them was about, you know, should you become activists as academics? And I think you need to be quite careful about that, because if you're seen to be on one side or the other, depending on the flavor of the government, you will either be listened to or not. However, if you're seen to be, this is the research I do, this is my specialty, here is the information, then you're, in a way, you're better trusted. So there's certain institutes that are trusted by this government will completely not be trusted by the next government. And so that's a risk, I think, that some of the academic institutes take, and they have to be quite careful about it. They make hay when, you know, when the sun shines and when their government is in place, wow, all straight ahead. But as soon as a change of government, they're not listened to at all. So I would argue or encourage academics to stay non-activist, but connect to the NGO community. That's, you know, obviously to your students, to the public, but connect to the NGOs by just feeding them information, because they're the skilled professionals at translating it and then lobbying, you know, folks like John and Trevor when Trevor was there.
Just to stay on that point, Julie, are there good avenues for exchanges between NGOs and the academic community, or do those really have to be made on a kind of personal and ad hoc level?
That's a great question. A lot of it is personal. That's my experience. It is on a personal level, and policy is a personal game. So, you know, if you want to affect Paul Martin when he was Minister of Finance, you know, he had a beer with Elizabeth May and a couple of environmentalists and said to them, what can I do now for you in the environmental field? I'm now the Minister of the Environment. And he famously quoted that he can start things, but he can't stop much. Very hard to stop the machinery of government. Easy enough for a politician, even the head of the department, to start something. So lobbying and policy is all about people. It's all about figuring out who the decision makers are, and there's not usually one. There's usually several, political and bureaucratic. And my most important stay-home message is do your stakeholder mapping. Find out who these people listen to. Who do they know? Who do they listen to? How do we get to them? And it may be you, or it may be your friend's friend who can pass the message, get that connection going. But like fundraising and like almost everything else in life, it's all about relationships, and it's person to person. So, you know, I don't know of any sort of formal, there's the Canadian Science and Policy Conference,
Yep.
maybe. But I think if you're really trying to affect policy, it's about people.
Thanks. So maybe we were talking a little bit about interventions, and maybe I'll turn to Tim now. And Tim, you're currently on the industry side. Are there particularly important avenues for intervention and engagement that you use? Are there sets of formal avenues such as public consultation processes? Or is it really about more the informal processes in terms of your own engagement? And I guess, again, thinking about how the research community might engage in government.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I'm really happy to be here. And I want to say that actually I think when we started, or just before we started, a couple people had said there was a common connection, I think, between all of us, and that's Monty Hummel from the World Wildlife Fund many years ago. But that's kind of an interesting connection. So to your question, I just wanted to add a couple of comments on the first question, and that is, I really think that one of the great gifts that academic researchers can bring to the policy forum is that independence. As I think John said, there's a certain public respect for the independence of scientists. I think generally speaking, when public polls are done or public surveys, they are considered the most trustworthy. And that continues. That's a pretty strong, consistent message from the public. So it's a really privileged place to be in. And I think especially in this moment, when we are seeing such intense polarization around issues, I think a really important role that you can play and academic researchers can play is to step back and is actually to bring people together. And I'll give you the example in my sector, in aquaculture right now. I've never been involved in an industry where the potential is so amazing, and yet the reality on the ground is sort of something very different, right? So we're in a stasis in terms of production, and we can't kind of break through. And there's a lot of public trust issues, and there's a lot of practice issues. Julie knows very well about that because she did a study on salmon farming in British Columbia. But again, there's such amazing things in the sector, and yet the polarization is intensely debilitating. So, you know, the possibility and the potential for academic policy researchers or institutes to bring those sort of poles together to try and sort of put together a constructive path forward. I think there hasn't been a time that has that kind of, you know, that great potential. So I do want to focus on the independence and sort of bringing people together. The only other thing I'll say is think tanks, and Neil, I'm coming back to your question, is in terms of interventions, I will say, you know, in your question, you did say lobbying as an informal sort of art or act, and I would say it's highly formal. I mean, certainly informal lobbying goes on, but in the last 10 years, we've seen almost a super formalization in some ways of lobbying activities. So they're, you know, quite highly regulated. Again, certainly there are activities that don't necessarily, you know, fall under the law, but or that escape the law, but I think it is very formalized. So I would say, you know, I'll just sort of talk about quickly my practice is, yes, there are things you get connected into finance committee, parliamentary hearings, you know, finance, but those are, you're one of thousands in a sense, or hundreds that participate in those. So I would say person to person, as Julie said, critical relationships, smart ideas, concise ideas. You know, we're in a minority setting, so making sure that you are connecting with, you know, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this, but sort of political priorities is absolutely essential, and making sure that you are very persistent in making your case. All those are I think are really critical pieces of finding success.
Great insights, Tim. Josh, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on this question as well, and maybe you've had a long history with ENGOs and oceans policy, and so from your perspective, how do you see these interventions, and how do you see the way to really get to get traction on sort of research-based policy ideas?
Well, I'm guessing there's a bit of something from exhaustion to panic amongst some of the people listening to this, thinking like, I need to do power mapping, I need to do relationship management, I need like managing all these, understanding all how governments. I just want to do my research and have it taken up. So I can. It's good advice, but I can imagine it can seem overwhelming, which is why those partnerships with the policy community are so important. You can rely on them to do some of that work. I mean, part of this to me comes back to, what do you want? I mean, what having your work policy relevant is quite broad. What do you want? I wouldn't say don't be an activist. I mean, I would say, more than that, thank God some of our academics on climate change were activists at a time when nobody was listening. They were the only people raising the alarm for a lot of years because they were at the forefront of it. But it is a choice, and you can't both be a independent voice and an activist at the same time. So you do have to make that choice to understand that once you become aligned on an issue and become an activist, then that you're then no longer going to be looked at by the government as an independent source of information. That's one. Number two is, when is it and how is it you want your work taken up? If you think that you're going to be at the table when the decision is made, the very point when your knowledge might be the most relevant is exactly when you're not going to be talked to. When you think about that black box process you talked about, the process is consult, go in the black box and make a political decision, where the concerns are more about stakeholders and the how it's going to be received out there, than with the have we got the policy bits quite right. So that is not your opportunity to influence policy. I would say it's back a few steps. The other point is it's a question of scale and timing. Research is often years and years in the making, when policy is often looking for very quick responses. Need to be short, quick, decisive. Here are the 3 things I recommend, and let me tell you why. And one of the best pieces of advice on lobbying that I ever got, which I think pertains as well to the research, is it's not good enough. It's not enough to have a good idea. You have to show how your idea is relevant to the priorities that have been set by the person that you're lobbying. I know that even at WWF and at Oceana, when people come and say, I think you should be working on this important thing, my response is usually, yeah, I'm working on 11 other important things, and I that we've chosen and made decisions on, and I just don't have bandwidth to do it. So governments are exactly the same, inundated with good ideas. So if you want your research to land, think about how it is policy relevant to the decisions, to the priorities that are set at the moment. And then make your choice about whether you're putting it into the public discourse, which has been very effective for researchers, I think, often in collaboration with NGOs or other institutions, and or whether you want to lean against that advocacy firewall. But those are some just quick thoughts about how to think about this space.
I want to say I do agree with Josh on that thank God there were some academics that did become activists. So yes, I agree with that. And I also agree with Josh that once you make that call, that's it. Like just what Josh said, you will no longer be viewed as sort of this independent person. You will be viewed as an activist academic. And yes, some of you need to do that. In fact, probably more of you need to do that. But if you don't want to do that, then you connect with the NGOs, feed them the information, let them be the activists, and you keep that sort of persona of being, you can be listened to whether it's a conservative or a liberal government, right? Once you become the activist, then one government will listen to you more than the other, C.D. Howe versus SPI, for example, right? So which government listens to which institute? But so if you want to maintain a sort of a view of independence, connect with the NGOs. You can do that quietly. You can feed information into them. But yeah, I'm glad that I'm very happy that there were some academics that went activist.
Neil,
Yeah.
can I make one follow-up to Julie's comment, and
Sure,
that is
absolutely.
back to my point about sort of independence and bringing people together, sort of finding constructive pathways forward. So Julie might be including industry associations when she's talking about NGOs, but I assume she's not. But I would say, I certainly would say industry has not done a great job at reaching out and listening. I think at the Mining Association, for instance, they've done some great work with their program towards sustainable mining, which Julie was very engaged in. And I was very aware of when it was starting. But I would say there are examples of really good listening and connections. It has to happen more, and we have to do a better job. But to all of you listening to this and participating, I would say, reach out to industry as well, because again, listening to both what they're saying, but also what the environmental groups are saying and others, social groups, I think bringing that all together is a privileged place for academics to be in. Thanks.
Thanks. Deb, did we have some questions popping up now?
We did, and if you look at the Q&A, our panelists, they're all coming from the same kind of, they're all on the same theme. And I think maybe pushing back at the idea that it is perhaps not just a question of, do we have a liberal or conservative government? Is there a broader bias? So if I'm a researcher, a policy researcher, and I want to get my research that is critical of the oil and gas industry out there, right? So that very first question in the Q&A is really asking, is it going to be received? Is the landscape open enough for me to access that? Will I be heard? And the second question is asking the same thing, my research on sustainability, right? Is it really, is there an audience for it? And I think in some of the answers that we just had from, or comments from the panelists, there are some seeds of ideas where, if government is perhaps less open to my research, should I be thinking about accessing NGOs? Should, Tim said, industry associations should be listening more. Should I be going to industry associations, right? But you can see those, really the first three questions in the Q&A are a little bit maybe doubtful about, the openness of the policy landscape to hearing about perspectives that are maybe a little bit critical of current policy.
Over to John.
So I think maybe building on some of the previous discussion and attempting to respond to that question, I think we need to be careful in this discussion in recognizing that in many cases, well, I think, I can't remember who said it, but you're almost never going to be in the room when the actual decision is made. In many cases, when major policy decisions are made, they're the culmination of years and sometimes decades of accumulated evidence and kind of social change in social values, and so yes, there's an important decision that each person needs to make in terms of whether to be kind of cross that line and become an advocate, or how much of your effort you want to devote to actually engaging with the policy process, as opposed to simply reinforcing an idea that, again, may take a long time to take hold. I mean, I have no illusions about the influence of my work, but for over a decade as a consultant, I spent a lot of time writing about carbon pricing, as did hundreds of other people around the world. And I'd like to think that there was some small incremental benefit to my contribution in just kind of building a social consensus around the need for that instrument. So that is one way in which people outside government can contribute. It requires kind of modesty and patience and acceptance about the very small incremental role that one can play in some cases, but it's an important role. Another point I'd make is that like government is not a monolith, and government is full of people with their own aspirations and their own interest in influencing policy. And I spend a lot of time talking to young civil servants about how to be an entrepreneur in government. And it sounds like an oxymoron, but you can't be a policy entrepreneur. And again, what it requires is patience and knowing, building evidence and knowing when the timing is right. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is there are lots of ears. And I appreciate that Julie had access to Paul Martin's ears, but there are lots of other ears that some of us have to kind of focus on, and at some point, hopefully, they will be in a position to be able to influence things.
So one of the themes that I think is coming up here is this sort of tension, between the sort of research and the ideas and the facts on the ground, and then the sort of politics that drives them. And one of the things that social scientists often talk about are policy windows, is that there are times when that are right for policies, and then there are times that are not. And I'm just, Josh, you're nodding, so I'll turn to you, and maybe if you can provide some insights on the timing and a little bit about your thinking about how groups outside government sort of manage and respond to the politics of the day without, becoming partisan in that regard.
Sure. I mean, it's we're activists, but we are not partisans. And there'll be people raising an eyebrow saying, yeah, really? No, really. One of the things that we always said at WWF was that we worked hard and well and got a lot done with Mike Harris and Mike Harcourt in Ontario. To those, I'm dating myself with those examples. You work with the government of the day. That is our responsibility to our donors and supporters, period. We have opinions, but you absolutely don't just go away and wait till a government of your particular flavor, if such a thing exists, comes in. And believe me, I've been surprised and disappointed by all sorts of governments, as any of us have been in this field. But I mean, it is about looking at the priorities. It is about matching priorities. I mean, it sounds like an oversimplification, but it starts there always. What are the priorities of a government that's been set out, and how do we? What are the potential linkages that we can create between the things that we want and the things that this government say they want? And they're not always obvious. Like if it's transparency, or if it's streamlined process, or if it's, take your pick. You find a way to say what I'm doing links to what you want. If you do what I want, it will deliver on this part of your agenda. That should be a pitch in any government meeting at any level. I had somewhere else I wanted to go with that if I can catch it quickly. No, lost it, but I'll stick with that point and pass it on.
Julie, do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, it was interesting. Josh is absolutely right in the concept of figuring out, basically it's all from the speech from the throne, the SFT. And John Moffat and Trevor know very well that feeding that speech from the throne, and Josh and Tim would know, trying to get into the speech from the throne is one of the techniques that NGOs use. So providing ideas to the political folks who are writing the speech from the throne, trying to get into the speech from the throne is where the NGOs work, probably the government officials work as well. Then once the speech from the throne is delivered, then Josh's technique of looking at that and saying, okay, what do we want? What do they want? How do we make that connection? I do recall, though, at one point when there were a lot of NGOs who had Ottawa offices, and then a change of government happened, and they all backed out of Ottawa and went back to the provinces, figuring that they wouldn't get much done at the federal level, and off they went into the provinces to try to get more done there. So I found that interesting, because that's a different perspective, or a different way of doing things, saying, okay, we're not going to get much out of this government, let's go focus somewhere else, versus what Josh said, which was, we're going to stay there no matter what. And we're going to look at their speech from the throne, look at their policy objectives, and try to figure out how we can get some progress on some of our issues.
Neil, I remembered my point, which I hope you might allow me to add, my little brain. But one of the bits of research that I think is probably underdeveloped is in exploring the consequences of those policy decisions, often unintended. So that's a window for policy research. When you look at the priorities of government, to say, if you pursue that, here's what our research shows it will and will not do, or might and might not do, and where it will lead. That does not, in my view, or does not necessarily cross over into the activist realm. That can still be played well in the independent kind of side of things. But that is where I think we need policy research and interventions on, here's what you say you want, let's look ahead at what will happen if you do that, good and bad and unintended. That's a great policy relevant research agenda, but is sometimes at tighter timelines, truncated timelines than researchers often work, but that's a really important one. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Deb, did we have a few more questions from the audience?
Yeah, we do. And here's one that is quite direct, that says, can the panel please comment on the green report that just came out of Newfoundland on how to dig the province out of debt? It had little input from academics and NGOs. And so a group of academics and NGOs responded with an alternative report. Now, I think whether you know anything about the green report or not, the question is, how can academics insert themselves better into the process when they're clearly not wanted? So Julie, you were talking about, well, Josh said, this could be years and years in the making of trying to prepare the ground. Julie, you were talking about, getting in on the writing of the speech from the throne. And then Josh was talking about what happens afterwards. What if nobody's interested in what you have to say? So, what are your options there?
I'm going to answer by just saying what John said. If you really believe in what you're doing is right, you keep on doing it. And it just means that right now is not the policy window has not opened for you. Another expression that they used to use in the federal government is hitching your project to the existing train. So there's a new train in town and it's heading out, and you want to hitch your project to that train. Sometimes it's impossible to do it. It just doesn't fit. The hitch doesn't fit. And so sometimes you continue to do the work that you want to do. There's always an alternative budget, for example, that the Canadian Policy Alternatives Group comes up with every year. Are they listened to? They keep doing it. And lobbying, as John said, policy decisions can take decades. It can take 35 years to get a new national park established. 35 years. We're talking an entire career can be spent trying to get one national park protected. So patience, humility, keep persistence.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just comment on the Newfoundland situation? And I don't know that much about the report, but I will say that when a government and region is in fiscal crisis, I think that the question goes to those most clearly in the know about how to control, for instance, spending, right? And academics do not necessarily have a reputation for controlling spending. In fact, it's the opposite, right? So I think that's perhaps why they went in that direction. They wanted people with, business, fiscal insights that could help, obviously, a crisis situation in Newfoundland.
Given the given the current state of university funding, you'd actually be surprised how well deans are at controlling spending these days. It's I think if you ask my dean, she'd say all she does is say no, when she'd much rather say yes. But
Neil, I've got another one. If
sure, yeah, go for it.
So just another sort of comment followed by a question from one of our attendees that said that, there was a good model that really brought sort of NGOs and the government together through the Canadian Environmental Network funding. And that was a way of institutionalizing these relationships and, ensuring that there were these channels open, and the attendees said it resulted in some good stuff, some good policy coming out. And then, with a change of government, that disappeared, those channels and the funding disappeared. Is that a way to go? Should we be, moving in that direction again? And Julie, I'm looking at you, you're I can see you're mulling that. Go ahead.
I think Tim should start because he's part of the Canadian Environmental Network.
Yeah,
my
thanks.
only short comment would be that, yes, the CEN did have a direct link to the Minister of the Environment, but so did World Wildlife Fund, so does the Nature Conservancy, so does Ducks Unlimited, so do many other larger national groups. So the CEN absolutely provided the opportunity for the small group that was fighting, spruce budworm in Cape Breton, where Elizabeth May started, and it allowed some direct link to that. There are other mechanisms, and the other one I'm thinking about is the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy.
Yeah.
But over to Tim, I think.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so I was actually the National Caucus Coordinator for Environmental Assessment many years ago, and at the CEN, it was a really great experience. I mean, the characters that were brought together were remarkable. Many who are still very, very engaged in policy. I agree with Julie, though, right? There's contact that many organizations have directly. I do also, I think that the evolution within the federal system is to not provide organizational funding, right? Except for exceptions like Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations. I don't think that that's a bad thing, because it does put the responsibility back on the organizations to say, what is the best structure for us, right? So do all those organizations, did they really like the CEN? It was a pretty complicated place in terms of governance. So it could be very messy at times, even though it did achieve some really good things. But I do think, again, there are other options, like roundtables, like regulatory advisory committees. I was engaged with the CEN with the 5-year review of the Environmental Assessment Act many years ago. When I was at the CEN, it was a really interesting process under Minister Anderson, and some things got accomplished. There were weaknesses, of course, as there are in all processes, but there are different ways of engagement. I think the time is past for the federal government funding institutions like that, though.
So again, one of the I think themes that's coming up is around presenting information to government and presenting ideas in an effective way. And again, one of the things that I would observe is that sometimes the research community has a set of ideas that are quite complex and quite nuanced, and we have to communicate those to government that in ways that aren't off-putting. And maybe I'll start with John on this one, but can you speak to how policy ideas ought to be pitched to sort of political and bureaucratic audiences? Are there a set of best practices when someone comes in to see you with an idea? What are you looking for in terms of what they put on your desk? We're constantly told that people, at high levels, don't have time to read, our 20-page paper, that we have to provide something more succinct, that normally we die a slow death when we have to reduce something to 3 pages, and it takes all the nuance out. So I guess, John, what do you see as an effective way in terms of how we can communicate with government?
Well, 2 things. I'll go back to Julie, know your audience. So not everybody's the same. But I don't agree. I mean, I guess I agree that the ability to communicate complicated ideas is important in any job. That doesn't mean you have to dumb the idea down necessarily. And I certainly do not agree that governments cannot be receptive to complicated ideas, or that you should not. That you should shy away from presenting them with all the nuances that are appropriate. I mean, if we're going to generalize about government, if you're presenting to a senior person, they're pretty busy. Some read everything. That's my tendency, but others don't. But if they don't, they have staff who do. So it's not like you're just talking to one person. You're generally talking to like if you have managed to gain an audience with somebody at a fairly senior level, then for the most part they will have taken the time to prepare, and if they haven't read your material, somebody else will, and they'll have been briefed. So I guess I would express caution about assuming that you have to go in with a 2-pager with 3 simple messages.
Neil, can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
My first jobs in government were actually, my first job was with the federal government in Parks Canada. And this is way back when I met Trevor. And one decision that my colleague had to make, so we were young, brand new employees in our 20s. She had to make the call as to whether or not to allow an Olympic ski event in Lake Louise National Park. And that decision, that little tiny, fairly inconsequential decision, took about 8 to 9 months to make. And she herself was lobbied by the Olympic Ski Association, the Canadian Ski Association, the Banff Tourism Association, the environmental groups who were opposed to it, the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I mean, name it. Everybody went to this young person to say, here is what we think about this decision. And she obviously did not make that decision, but she would have briefed someone like John or someone like Trevor and said, and her job would have been to say, here is everything that I have heard about this. Here are what everybody thinks about this tiny, inconsequential decision. So I just wanted to give that perspective on how long it takes, the impact of one individual at a very low level, listening to everybody, briefing someone like John or Trevor. That is how it works. Also, I just wanted to contrast that with the huge, fast decisions that were made during COVID. I was gobsmacked at how fast the civil service worked in the federal government to get money out the door, CERB, all those programs. It is a testament to the strength of our civil service, the professionalism of our civil service, to be able, because they have been planning and thinking about and all that good solid work that feels like John said, minutia, like small, my small incremental contribution. Wow, in the time of a crisis, bang, we came out with decisions and they were made fast. So interesting perspective on how decisions can be made in the federal civil service. And John said it, like you can go to the staff people who are working on, find out who is working on that file, who is that expert that John will go and touch and say, tell me more about this, right? And that's the person that you start with. Sorry, I could keep going.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. It's great insights from everyone. Maybe Josh or Tim, do you have do your groups have any particular processes when you go into government? Do you usually go in with something in hand? Is it a 2-pager? Is it a policy brief? You know, how do you handle those communication challenges, and you know, and how do you back them up in terms of the empirical evidence that you're relying on when you're making points?
Can I just interrupt? And my apologies again. I have to leave, and
yes.
I know I'm sorry to leave in the middle of an interesting discussion. Best wishes to everybody. Super interesting and important discussion. Stay in touch.
Thank you very much for fitting us into your busy schedule, John. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure.
I'll just take over as the bureaucrat now, John.
All right.
Yes, of course. You know, we have a plan going in, and I mean, I do agree that bureaucrats are quite capable of understanding complicated arguments. But I'd also say you better damn well be ready with a 1-pager and being able to say really clearly what you're there for and what you want to talk about. And that is much of policy writing is very different from classic academic writing. I think most people probably know this, but I talk about it as didactic versus, or inductive versus deductive. In the academic writing, it's often like, here's the question, because, therefore, here's what I arrived to. And you have to absolutely flip that on your head in your delivery and in your writing when you go into an ADM's office or a deputy's office or a minister's office or a staffer's office. Here is my conclusion, and here's, you know, I can tell you why, and you better have that in the page. You can also have the thick, weighty tome to drop impressively on the desk with the facts behind it, and which sometimes will be read, but you'd better be able to say very clearly in a small number of things that you want. And I was musing about the research design and research questions. I used to be a communications director, and it drove me nuts when people would say, like, here, I wrote this important piece, go communicate on it. And now as an ED, I can tell you, we take a very different design that I wish actually more NGOs would. We think about the audience we're designing the piece for. We write it based on that audience. Like, are we writing a science paper? Are we writing a policy paper? Are we writing it, is it 3 pages or is it 50 pages? And you do that at the very outset. You don't put pen to paper until you've thought about what it is you're trying to do with the piece that you're writing. It's very, very purposeful writing, which sometimes is a lengthy tome, but sometimes is not. So you have to back up in your creation of write documents and pieces to think about what is it you want that piece to do. If you write it and then think of that, it's too late and you've lost that window.
I think the 1-pager is uber important. So environmental groups and industry groups usually have what they call lobby days on Parliament Hill, where they go in and they try to meet with as many MPs and or staffers that they can in a sort of blitz. We did it at the Mining Association, and we also did it with the Green Budget Coalition, which is a group of environmental groups working on greening fiscal policy. And you would leave a 1-pager so that if you didn't meet with the MP, or even if you did, you had 5 or 6 points on that page. That was it. That's all you wanted to say. You would also leave your background paper as well. I have to say, Oceana does some of the absolutely best, most spectacular materials on that. When I was at the Auditor General's office as the commissioner, we were like, wow, we need to look like Oceana when we deliver our reports. So when you're trying to communicate well, complicated things, look at Oceana stuff.
I actually use one of Oceana's placemats in a course I teach on policy communication, or part of the part. So it's which Trevor gave to me, which I thought was amazing. Tim, did you want to jump in on this?
Look, I agree with everything that was said. I also think back to our earlier discussion in terms of the complexity of an argument or a background paper. Yeah, I mean, of course, those are critical, and especially dependent on who you're meeting with, right? So again, at the bureaucratic level, you can be meeting with policy analysts. Providing that for background reading can be really helpful. But even, you know, at every level, I think, you know, that either that summary, that one page, or that 1 to 2 page briefing note that captures sort of the high level, you know, akin to a summary for policymakers, which we all know has been so influential at the international level with the IPCC. You know, that is what, you know, 99% of the world's going to read, not the 1% who read the academic. Not that that's not important, but that's just the way it is. So I think that that's increasingly the case too, especially at the political level. And one of the questions, Neil, you'd put out is staffers. Yeah. And when you're talking about ministerial staffers, all of us know, like, it's as we get older, it's amazing to see how young, you know, a number of the staffers are, and how much burden is put on their shoulders, right? So you've got staffers who have to deal with hundreds of issues, basically none of them which they'll have any background in. So they're learning kind of as they go in the fire, and so to sort of have the skill to pick out, again, what Josh said, you know, their fundamental interest, either that's in the minister's mandate letter or in the platform, and then building around that why what you are offering is a solution, is an answer to what they are looking for, is so important. So yeah, I'll stop there, but that's I think it's all consistent with what we've said.
Yeah, can I offer one other idea, which was that when we were lobbying the Canadian Wildlife Service for the introduction of the endangered species legislation, we actually commissioned draft legislation that we then gave to the Canadian Wildlife Service and said, here, have a look. So that's not one pager, right? That's detailed legal wording that we could offer as a draft for the policymakers to have a look at. So just in terms of, you know, it depends what you're looking for. We were looking for a new law, and it took us 9 years. One of the civil servants at the time in the Canadian Wildlife Service told us it would take at least 13 years. So we were like, rah, 9. But, you know, before that, there was no law to protect endangered species. Whether we think it's a great law or not, you know, that's a whole other question. But we had nothing before, and at least now we have something. It took 9 years. And as part of that, we presented a fully drafted piece of legislation for them to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly noticed that with the new Impact Assessment Act, that a lot of ideas that were being talked about in the academic community, sustainable assessment, regional assessment, have found their way into that act. And it's obviously been a long, you know, people have been talking about these ideas for 15 years, and that is, as you all know, that piece of legislation has sort of, you know, ping-ponged around with governments. Tim, I want to come back to you because you said something.
Neil, I think Trevor had a
sorry, Trevor. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my system, I don't seem to be able to raise my electronic hand, so I was trying my physical one. I just offered 3 points to this conversation to chip in. Partly, I wasn't entirely in jest when I said I'd replace John, because the job I had until fairly recently was quite similar to his. Form really matters. And one of the things I've learned now that I'm in the academic side of life is that it's very wounding on occasion to say to academics generally, no one reads journal articles. But one of the things that if I wanted to call out my fellow panelists and John was still on, and I'd say, okay, fess up, when was the last time you read an article published in the journal of nobody cares? The senior body, at least, doesn't do that. Some of the people, as John mentioned, when you're talking to an ADM, it's not just an ADM, it's kind of like the board, you know, like John, who's just signed off, he's got 1,900 staff, 1,900. So, you know, he'll assign some things, reading act tasks, so to speak, and get briefed up and so, but even then, journals have minimal impact. Petitions, in my experience, have no impact, but people seem to love that one too. Sorry, Josh. But you know, that I think is but very focused and very specific things, whether it's placemats, one pagers, those sorts of things. And Julie bang on in saying that things like a whole new draft legislation, so that works really well. The aquaculture industry is very active in this front now, for example, trying to build a rational approach to the legislation or management rather of aquaculture, which is an enormous industry for which there's no legislation in our country at the national level. So form, my point, I guess it really matters. The second thing is that timing. One of the things I've discovered as a prof now is that if I issue a set of deadlines for assignments, I've yet to have a student say, oh, it's okay, I got mine done 5 days in advance. I'm feeling good. That doesn't happen. And if you add, say, 2 days to the deadline or 3, everybody will hand them in 2 or 3 days later. Bureaucrats are the same. Bureaucrats will go, sweet, I have an extra week. It's going to take an extra week. If the minister says, how long will this take? The bureaucrats will always push for the most and hope that they'll only be 5 or 6 days late and so on. So things move much more slowly, I think, than people understand, and that really matters. The final point I'd make, in just in terms of information, one of the things, Neil, I think we need to be cognizant of, that this conversation so far, and it hasn't really reflected much, is government works hard to lobby out as well. We talk a lot about how do you influence government. I can tell you from experience, I would regularly phone up people like Josh or Julie or Elizabeth or so on and so on and so on and say, you know, can we go have lunch? I'd be trying to influence them. I'd be trying to develop products where I'd say, you know, I don't want to be rude or anything, but your position on this, this, and this is just garbage. I think what you need to be doing is, so there's an awful lot of government outward influencing, not only to environmental groups, but to industry as well. And again, format and timing really matters a lot. And people have to give thought to that. And it's, as Josh said earlier, it's very much figure out your audience and what she or he is likely to consume and build to that, rather than I happen to have a widget, I hope you like it.
Thanks, Trev. I think we have a whole bunch of questions, Deb, so maybe we should, I know we've got an audience that's really keen to engage, so maybe I'll turn it over to you for a bit.
And it's funny that the questions they really cluster around a few themes. So building on sort of what you were talking about just before, well, it relates to this question about how, you know, the form of advice that you're giving or you're feeding into the policy process, hopefully, but it's the climate issue, right? So Julie, you made the comment that COVID, man, things move fast. They moved so quickly. I mean, I thought so too. It was so impressive, right? Why can't we do the same on climate, right? So we've got a question about, well, it doesn't seem like the climate stuff is moving as quickly. Somebody else saying, you know, can we use the science more quickly? Has anything changed? So I think a really great question for the panel, which I think pulls on a few of the questions in the Q&A, is, are we in a different moment? Do you see policymakers reaching out, using science, using research, you know, and for so many, there's another question that seemed so, seemed to really describe a lot of us, working for 30 years on climate change, you know, and maybe we missed our policy window, or is this it, right? So, you know, is there something about this moment that we're more open to researchers working on climate change and sustainability? Are people listening, etc.?
Who wants to start? I can start.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Wow. So I sure hope so is my answer. I sincerely hope so. So for those of us who've been around, Tim, Josh, myself, I mean, I started in this world in the 80s. And when I went to the Paris Climate Conference and saw all the premiers, all the prime ministers, all the presidents, all talking about climate change, when in the 80s, we were considered, you know, Birkenstock tree huggers. And all of a sudden, everybody is talking about climate change. So that was huge from, you know, it took 30 years. Will we move faster now? I think the world is moving potentially faster than Canada is. And we are in a very difficult position until we achieve the just transition that we have to have, because we are talking about, I'm going to say 500,000 people in Canada who are completely dependent on the oil and gas sector in this country, maybe more. And we need to quickly transition them to a new world. And if we don't get that transition right, given that we're sitting on, you know, one of the world's biggest sources of oil that needs to sit in the ground, this is a complex question for a Canadian government. And I think the world is sort of leaving us behind, and we're struggling because we are a potential energy superpower, and we actually have to figure out how to move a whole crew of people away from this energy source and this workplace. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I have to quote my Hemingway here. When in Sun Also Rises, he talked about bankruptcy and said, "I went bankrupt in two ways: first gradually, and then suddenly." And that is the nature of policymaking. Always, change doesn't happen slowly. Change happens really quickly, followed by periods of stasis. So, Julie, I'm only going to quibble with your words, Julie. Your sentiment was exactly right about the length of time things take, but I wouldn't call it that we need to be patient. I'd call it we need stamina, because I actually think we should be impatient, not just on climate change. As a matter of fact, I am paid to be impatient. I am proudly impatient. Things should not take 35 years. They often do. So if you burn out in 2 years, frustrated that you haven't got it, then you'll last exactly 2 years. But I think we need more impatience, not patience. And I think a really important thing Trevor was getting at about bureaucrats, which is actually about all of us, really, as he was saying. But bureaucrats are inherently conservative. And by conservative, I mean resistant to change for a good reason. And politicians are the ones who actually are probing often the margins, sometimes destructively, as any bureaucrat will tell you, like, what did they just agree to? If they'd only asked me, I could have told them that was a terrible thing to do and all the 10 reasons why. But that's actually often where the impetus for change comes, is from the political side, which is then, you know, redirected, or kind of the worst of it pushed out and the best of it brought in on the bureaucratic side. But bureaucrats are inherently conservative, resistant to change, you know, about status quo often. Not always, but it's a one way to think about the different levers you've got. So are we in an open period? Is the Overton window, as they say, wide open right now on policy? Maybe, or just as likely, there's going to be exhaustion after this, and it's going to go back to a period of stasis. So it will be what we make of it, I would say.
Yeah, and one of our attendees made the really good point that we got a lot to do before 2030 and then 2050. And if things are moving slow, you know, so it's kind of a question of how do we speed things up? And a number of the questions in the Q&A are like, how do we get things moving more quickly? But Tim, maybe you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to say two things briefly. One is of course in COVID, we're faced with death, right? Climate is still that slightly intangible, right? And so of course the government, its first priority is to protect the life of its people, right? So they're going to move extremely quickly, and they did, Julie, right? It's hard to see that kind of speed with something that still is, for many people, yes, people want to see action, but it's kind of still intangible, right? So that's just one comment. The other thing is, I will pick up, and I will say this is a problem for the environmental policy community that I would like to address, is I've heard many times the admonition to transition workers from sectors. And so Julie, you brought up oil and gas, and that's 500,000 people, right? And this is one province. But I've heard that so often with forestry, you've heard it from mining, We hear it now in aquaculture, right, on the West Coast. Where are all these people going? Right? Like, so why I'm asking everyone, like, there's this desperate need for constructive, practical, I think, transition, movement, path forward, because it's just unrealistic when we hear these sort of calls for transition to something that isn't really realistic. So I want to challenge everyone that that's an easy out, but it's not realistic, and it's not particularly helpful for government people or policy leaders, because you can't just transition 1 million Canadians into some new jobs that don't exist, right? That's not possible. So anyway, just a small challenge for everyone.
I think the other problem with the transition idea, even though we have to figure it out, is that the oil and gas sector actually is one of the highest paying sectors in the economy, higher than mining jobs. So with a high school diploma, you can become a mine truck driver in the oil sands and make six-digit. You can make as much as Neil and as a university professor makes, and you've got a high school degree and you're driving a truck. So when if we can transition these people to, say, windmills or solar power, I'm guessing the salaries aren't nearly as high in that. And so that is part of the policy difficulty with the idea of transition. I mean, when they just shut the coal mines, right? And didn't do a just transition. So you can do that too. But yeah, it's definitely, none of this stuff isn't simple. It looks simple and it sounds simple, but the bureaucrats would know, Trevor would know, this stuff is really quite complex in terms of dealing with issues that government has to deal with: equity, transparency, accountability, fairness, a whole pile of issues that when policy is looked at, they're looking at it through a variety of different gender. They're looking at it through a variety of different lenses. Climate is a new lens to look at through. So yeah, policy making is a tough job.
Yeah, but I feel the need to say, as I'm jumping out of my seat here, that transition is going to happen, and we can either plan it or just be on the receiving end of it. When the cod fishery collapsed because we couldn't make the tough decision when we saw what was happening, and 30 to 40,000 people were out of work, they found work in the oil sands at huge cost to the communities and culture in Newfoundland that is still being felt today. The transition is happening. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. It's going to be imposed upon us. So do we need a transition? Yes. Would I like it to be equitable? Can we do it over 10 years rather than over 6 months? I'd sure like to think so. But I do think Alberta in particular, to get on my high horse, has been like egregiously, terribly, decades long, multiple governments avoiding the idea of diversification of the economy and moving away from what's coming. And it's doing Canadians and the people who are in that industry a profound disservice. So we should not be glib. And there I'm 100% agreed with Tim. It's very easy for me to say from my NGO seat, go find it, go retrain and do another job and move away. That's enormously disruptive to the communities that are there, and unfair and mean-spirited to be glib about it, and inequitable and just all sorts of bad words. So it is tough, it is difficult, but boy, we sure be talking about it, because it either happens in a way that we can have some influence on, or it's just imposed upon us.
Can I probe a little bit here, because we had at least 5 questions, comments in the Q&A about what exactly independent research is. And so what is it actually an independent researcher? So, I have been writing on Canadian environmental policy for 30 years. I want a certain kind of, environmental policy to happen. I guess I consider myself activist, and yet I consider myself also to be an independent researcher. So somebody's doing some work on the green transition, right? How do you not be an activist or perceived as an activist in this very debate that right away fires up in this panel, right? How do we present ourselves as providing policy relevant research that we hope will influence the policy process without looking like an activist? So I don't know, Josh, you were nodding your head.
Well, I mean, more out of agreement that that's a difficult question than out of,
Yeah.
a smart thing to add on. I mean, there is a difference. I mean, no work is, no research, no opinion, no anything is lacking in bias, right? So in that sense, the question is fair. Everything is contextual. So everything has some priors that are involved in it and therefore can't be truly independent, whatever that means. But I think there is a difference between putting information out for public discourse, putting it out publicly and letting it be taken up, and actively interpreting your own work to a specific policy conclusion that is, partisan or that falls along the split that Tim rightly recognized that we are so often in. So I think it's a question of degree rather than a binary thing. It's it's like irony. You know it when you see it. You know activism when you see it, even if it's hard to describe. But putting it out into the public discourse to be taken up and argued on either side is certainly on one end of that spectrum versus walking into the minister's office and lobbying along with an NGO on a specific policy outcome is on the other end, and then you find your way between those.
Yeah.
I might just add on this one a little bit on the nature of research. In my last job at Department of Fisheries and Oceans for 4.5 years, I was the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Science. The group that I was responsible for was about 2,200 people. It was a budget of about $450 million a year. It had 16 ships, 22 institutions. We had 442 PhDs, 9 Nobel laureates in the group. It's pretty high powered, and I would consider it as very independent. Is there such a thing as unbiased research? No, it does not exist, at least in my opinion anyway. But I would always look at that as a source of advice to a minister that I could say to her, Minister, the best scientific advice that we've been able to assemble on cod populations, on environmental trends, on the impact of aquaculture, on blah, blah, on and on and on it goes, would come from in that particular group. To say that it was, biased and so on, I think is fairly dismissive. Having said that, we also would listen very carefully to what we would describe as sort of carefully thought through and well-reasoned and well-presented research from a whole variety of other sources, including academia, of course, but not only. And so to me, the idea that we would sort of anoint one particular sector, one particular source as independent and another as biased, I reject that. I think that there's a tendency, in my experience in the environmental community, to say that anything that is funded by, not produced by, but funded by the oil industry should be immediately discounted. I worked a lot on the issues associated with diluted bitumen and what its impacts are and so on. And I can't tell you the number of people that would say, oh, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers contributed $1 to Dr. So-and-so at the University of Alberta. Ignore everything she says.
Yeah.
I just think that's naive and unhelpful. I think that the question really, it goes back to something someone said earlier. We lack governance systems that bring people together to listen to a diversity of views and work through the research results. That, to me, is an enormous problem in our policy dynamic, because we just don't put people together. And Tim said about half an hour ago, we've created this tremendously polarized arrangement where we just don't bring folks together in ways that allow these kind of conversations to occur. I think that is a way of heavily mediating and understanding whether their biases or perspectives is a point of view, I guess. But this notion that there's some independent thing and you're activist, you're not, I don't find that very helpful.
Trevor, great points. And I just say, I wanted to give a couple of examples. One in Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Trevor, you'll be very familiar with this, is the CSAS process. So it's the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat. It's an interesting approach. I'm sure it's not perfect, but what it does is it sort of brings together academic, government, NGO scientists into a body to look at science, to kind of look at risk through all that science. And again, it's not perfect, but it is a way to kind of bring together different communities of scientists. And I think it's from a fisheries perspective, it does some good work. Again, not perfect. And yeah, and I think more of those are needed, more processes where we can bring people together with very different viewpoints, almost in that scientific inquiry, right? Dispute is good. If everyone's agreeing, that's not a good science place to be. So it's the same thing with policy. Get some really good argumentation and bring it all together in a dynamic way.
I would say that there used to be some of those places. So the National Roundtable was one of those.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing.
And there was something called the New Directions Group.
Yes.
For that,
Toxics.
Where we brought CEOs of like Alcan and Noranda and Falconbridge, and then CEOs of Pollution Probe and Nature Canada and WWF. And we would just come together and sit at tables and come up with some policy positions that we actually presented into government, including what I think we started the National Pollution Release Inventory, the NPRI, was started basically by this group of CEOs of NGOs and CEOs of big corporations, and working together, we came up with something that we presented into government. One of the learnings I had with many of those sort of multi roundtable experiences, including at the Mining Association, is that people view others, with a lens. So, the environmentalists think that all the mining and oil and gas people are just out for the money, mean, profit driven, ugly, terrible people. And those people, the mining and oil and gas people, see the environmentalists as lying, fundraising, trying to change through sort of really negative on both sides, like looking at each other. But when you actually bring them together around a table and they get to know each other, the trust that builds and the switching that happens. So when you hear a mining executive say, well, my mine in such and such a country, or even in Canada, in Northern Ontario, has given jobs to all these First Nations people, all these Aboriginal people. It's brought people out of poverty. And I think that's a good thing. Well, then the environmentalist or the social activist looks at that and goes, okay, well, I didn't even know you were thinking about that, right? And then when the mining person sees the environmentalist and says, we're not lying, we're bringing people's values forward. It's a different perspective. The trust actually grows, people flip a little bit, and yes, you can come to better policy decisions that way. And that is absolutely missing in Canada right now.
I'd say, here, that's such an important point. A lot of the people who you might see in industry were in environment before. A lot of people in government were used to be in industry. Like, there is more movement, and there should be, between those sectors. So if to turn it to a piece of advice, it is, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with people, whether it's the policy advisor or whether it's the bureaucrat or whether it's the industry person, NGO person. They're people first and foremost who in 99%, I've met some terrible people on all sides, but very, very, very few. The vast majority are people who are actually believe in what they're trying to do from different perspectives. I can disagree with them often a lot, but that's it. It's such an important point. I know as we're nearing an end too, to remember that you're dealing with people first, and treat them that way first before you get to anything else.
I'd really emphasize that point from the perspective of students, not to overly personalize things, but if you look at Julie, who spent a whole early part of her career in a nature organization and then went to mining. If you look at Tim, who spent a large part of his time in rural wildlife and went to industry, movement back and forth, I think, is really, really valuable and important. Yeah. And anybody thinking about a career in broad sustainability movement or whatever it is, I would encourage you as strongly as possible to think about that and avoid locking yourself into one little thing, because think of what Tim said a minute ago. Dispute is good. Dialogue, debate, and so on is good. We don't have the venues for it. But I can tell you, I used to say to a minister, here's a little tip for you. As soon as someone from the outside says to you, all the scientists agree on this point, stop listening. As soon as they say that, just don't listen to anything that follows, because it's just garbage. Because anybody who feels that tries to argue, it's just ridiculous, right? And as Josh said about an hour ago, policy is personal. You get people together, and Julie just said this, she put a bunch of wise and keen and committed women and men in the room together and so on. Most of the time, good stuff will happen. I think one of the real tragedies of what the federal government has done to this country in the last little while is that a lot of those collaborative fora, we've talked about some of them today, the Canadian Environmental Network, the Roundtable, and so on, they're gone. And this is not just a bunch of people late in their career saying, oh, I wish it was back like when I was younger. That's not it. I don't wish things were like when I was younger. I definitely don't on something. But, you know, I sit there and I think there's nowhere to have any of these arguments and debates. And to me, one of the huge contributions that the policy community and academia could make is to figure out how to get these sorts of venues, conversations, dialogue fora, whatever you want to call them, in place so that we can generate solutions in a much more modern sort of way than our historic purpose, practice rather, which is develop a discussion document, send it to 5 million people, take the comments you like and tell the minister everybody agrees. I mean, that we need to get over that and do something that reflects approaches and procedures of 2020, not 1920.
Yeah, and I think that's an important role for universities. I think universities could fill that gap to some degree. And I think, you know, and I'll editorialize a bit, that universities are also conservative institutions and risk adverse in terms of their own engagement with some of these issues. We've seen this with the, you know, with the debate on climate policies in universities. For example, we had a huge debate at this university about declaring a climate emergency. And you know, which we just did, happily say, but it took a lot of convincing people that a kind of obvious physical reality that the university could comment on that. I did say to our panelists that we sort of try to keep it to 90 minutes, and I think 90 minutes is sort of where people's Zoom levels start to de-zoom a bit. But maybe I'll just give everyone one last chance, and maybe I'll ask my last question, which is really, you know, are there areas or elements of policy areas within the environment that you think are not getting enough attention? Are there things that you'd like to see the research community do, whether it's driving public discussions, whether it's convening, or whether it's a substantive thing like we need more work on just transitions or bringing people together? So you've got, you know, 50 odd, many emerging researchers on the line. So I'll give you each a chance to give your wish list. So maybe I'll start with Josh, then go to Tim, then Julie, and then Trevor. I'll give you the last word.
I don't really have a strong feeling with that, except to say that if there's one thing that would be helpful to me, so might as well make it, self-interested here, is the research and good thinking on the consequences of different policy proposals that are out there, whether it's in throne speeches or mandate letters out there. I mean, that's the kind of thing I could certainly use that does not necessarily at all stray into the activist field, and is helpful for policymakers and those of us who try to influence policy alike.
Thanks. Tim?
I'll be a lot more self-interested than Josh, but I'll say I find the area that both Josh and I are focused in, which is oceans and sort of blue economy, is a real emerging area that is very kind of new. There's a lot of opportunity there to do a lot of interesting thinking, and just one quick stat from that may not be widely known is over 70% of the earth is covered by oceans, and we humans get 3% of their food from the oceans at the moment. And with an expanding global population, I think extracting food sustainably from the oceans is a huge and really interesting challenge. And I haven't seen Josh in a little while, but I hope we can work very closely, and Julie, you too, on sort of constructive and very interesting pathways of getting it right. right? So I think there's a lot of policy and science opportunity in that particular area. So very, very self-interested, but thanks for indulging me.
Not at all. Julie.
Yeah, well, I don't feel like I have any self-interest anymore. I'm the one retired, semi-retired person here. I'm gonna say, if I was talking to a group of students, I would say go where your heart is. Go follow the issue that's most important to you. Not patience. I agree with Josh. Have stamina. Continue to push it. Work with others. This is all about people. We've said it a couple of times, but you want to influence, it's about people. So up your people skills, be they in written form and or in person or via Zoom. But and then I guess the last thing is from a research perspective is what kind of world do we want to live in? And bring your passion to that. That would be my biggest advice.
Thanks, Julie. Trevor, last word to you, or maybe second last word to you.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks everybody for joining us today. To say, I know Neil's going to make that same comment, but I just would emphasize it in advance. I'd certainly agree that the follow your heart and so on, as Julie has said, I think is really important. Continuously learning about these issues, doing this kind of thing, I think is really important. Asking lots and lots of questions and listening carefully to the answers is something I find, unfortunately, quite rare. And the number of times when I was in previous roles and even now as a prof, I'm often dismayed at how little people interrogate the system and think about things that they hear back. I was joking at the very beginning here today, one of the students that's online is Maggie Bunbury, who was in one of my classes. She's just the question machine. I love it. And we need to do that sort of thing more because it's a sign of respect, but also you learn an awful lot that way. In terms of substantive matters, I think that research from the policy community around governance, I think, is critical. We have built a whole series of tools in the conservation movement that were designed back before I had gray hair in my beard. Our new legislation, Species at Risk, is now 20 years old, 22 actually. Our new migratory birds legislation is now 152 years old. On and on and on and on it goes. We're building and trying to manage systems with institutions and so on that were designed last century. We don't make decisions in a way that reflects this century, and research around how better to do that, I think, is critical. And then the second and related piece is generating research results and advice that take account of multiple perspectives, similar to what you've heard around this table. I hate it when I hear people say, we need to take an ecosystem-based, multi-temporal, spatially diverse, inclusive, and a really nice process. I just want to throw up. But having said that, we do need to think of things that actually listen to and itemize different ways of looking at it. I go back to this Rubik's Cube. No minister and no CEO, no executive director, no dean is ever going to do something that is focused on one narrow thing. If you say to a minister, I actually don't know what the vast majority of the community thinks, but I know I'm right, forget it. They just don't. So the more research that we can do that generates and incorporates multiple perspectives on a particular issue with a pragmatic outcome, I think the better. So well, that's all for me. Thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Well, thank you, Trevor. As I said at the beginning, Trevor was really instrumental in bringing this panel together. You know, one of the things I've been, people always ask you how your pandemic's going. And from an academic perspective, I think my observation is a lot of the things that really give us energy, engaging with students, engaging with other researchers, have been taken away from us a bit. We're doing a lot of interaction through Zoom. And so it's really great to have an interaction like this, which for me has really been really personally energizing and motivating to hear these great ideas. So thank you, Julie, Tim and Josh and John for joining us. It's really been terrific. You've given us a ton to think about. I take away some ideas around I think I'm remotivated to think about the role, and this is something Trevor and I have been talking about for a while, about how we can get our university to be more of a convener, to bring more people in, to have these discussions. Like a lot of people here, I became involved with some of the roundtables work on climate, and I found it a really great experience. And I think that's missing in Canada, and I think universities need to step up. And the big message, I guess, I hear from all of you is engage, engage, engage. And I can't remember who said it, but I think you all repeated it, that policy is people, and we have to put the people in policy. And I think maybe sometimes we need to be reminded of that. So thank you for reminding us of that and giving us lots to think about. And thanks to everyone in the audience side for showing up. It's great that you're still with us and still engaged, and we look forward to engaging you in person in the fall when things open up. Deb, any last words from you? And
oh, just thank you so much. And I too feel very energized. And a last note, that when you were each of you talking about what research you would like to have done on a number of those things, there's research out there, but we're clearly not getting it to you. So, we need to do a better job. So thank you so much.
So thanks everyone, and thanks Joanne, as always, for capably managing everything, and our staff at the Balsillie School for making this all possible. And we look forward to seeing everyone in person as soon as we can. But in the meantime, stay safe and have a great summer.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.